Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the How to Contract show. I'm Laura Frederick. I'm the founder and CEO of How to Contract. Now, How to Contract is all about practical real world training for in-house teams and lawyers on how to draft and negotiate commercial contracts. It's about no fluff. It's about telling you the core content you need to know to do the work you do every day on the contracts that you handle. This first episode is going to go into two really important documents in the contracting process, and that's the purchase order and the sales quote. The session's broken up into three parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about what is a sales quote? What is a purchase order? How do they fit in the contract formation world of offer and acceptance? And why are they important? The second part, I'm going to get into the process. I'm going to talk about the life cycle of a sales quote purchase order and the different things you need to know about each stage in that process so that you can manage that process to reduce the risk of the transaction and make sure that the contract that you have with the counterparty is the contract you want and that you knowingly agree to. And then the last part of this episode will cover the contents of the sales quote and the contents of the purchase order. And I'm going to get into more detail about each of the parts you see in those and what kinds of things you should be looking for. So with that, let's kick off this episode. So what is a sales quote and what is a purchase order and how do they relate to each other? So let's kick off with a sales quote. A sales quote is a document, some kind of writing from a vendor to a potential customer that outlines the terms that the vendor is proposing to sell something or license something to that potential customer. So it typically is written in a variation of, I, the seller, will sell you, the buyer, 20 widgets for $20 each and deliver them by Tuesday. We're going to get into more of the details about what they actually say in the real world, but just think about it like that. It's basically a seller proposal. Sales quotes only come from the vendor. A customer never issues a sales quote in its role as a customer. And a seller or a vendor never issues a purchase order in its role as a customer or as a seller. Sales quotes always originate from sellers. Purchase orders always originate from buyers. Now, these are two documents that say very similar things because when you look at a purchase order issued by a customer, at its core essence, it's always more complicated, but at its core, it says, I, buyer, agree to purchase from you, seller, 20 widgets for $20 each to be delivered by Tuesday. Okay, so you notice that we have two contract documents that have the very similar terms or at least cover the same subject matter. So which set controls? Whose document is going to determine what that is? If they say exactly the same thing and there's no difference, nothing different about either of them, well, that's easy enough. It doesn't really matter. They're both, say the same thing. Those are the terms. But that never happens. So what typically happens is the seller will send a sales quote that'll have terms, and the buyer will issue a purchase order with different terms or additional terms or rejecting some of the terms that the seller had and accepting others. And how do you figure all that out? And to understand how to figure that out, the battle of sales quote versus purchase order, you have to understand the core concepts of offer and acceptance in contract law. Now, I don't usually get into a lot of contract law stuff and the background, but this is so critical. And if you don't understand offer and acceptance, you can't understand how to work with sales quotes and purchase orders. Because what we are really doing with sales quotes and purchase orders is trying to control the story. We're trying to control the story of what is the deal that we have done. Again, if they're both the same, we have one story, it's not an issue. But if the seller has different things in its quote from what the buyer has in its purchase order, now we have two different stories of this transaction. We have two different sets of terms, and now we've got to reconcile those and figure out which one is really, at the end of the day, the transaction that we're doing. So I'm going to step back and let's talk the offer and acceptance. Now, the basic rule of contract law is a contract is formed when there's offer, acceptance of that offer, and consideration. Consideration is value. We're not going to worry about that for this training because that doesn't really come up as a big issue for almost any commercial transactions, B2B commercial transactions. There's always some value. So we're going to focus on offer and acceptance. And I want to step away from the sales quote and purchase order framework and talk about a simpler transaction. And the classic one I always use is painting my house. So I have a painter, he's standing on, my sidewalk. He says, I will paint your house for $10. Do you accept? He's made an offer. I'm standing on the sidewalk or on my front porch and I say, yes, I accept. Offer. I heard the offer. I accepted it. We've now got a binding contract. Yes, it's oral, other issues, but we're going simple here. So we've got a binding contract for him to paint my house for $10. But you'll notice we didn't talk about anything else. We didn't talk about what color. We didn't talk about when. We didn't talk about when I had to pay him. All those details are up in the air, and we don't have clarity on those. So one of the things we're trying to do with sales quotes and purchase order is get beyond the simple and get into the details so that the parties have a meeting of the mind on more of the nuance of the transaction. How much am I going to pay? What's the deadline for me to pay? What color are you going to paint my house? What kind of paint are you going to use? What's the timeline for it and the deadline? What happens if you don't paint my house? What happens? Can you call your cousin Vinny and have him paint it instead? All those kinds of details are the things that we are putting in the sales quote or purchase order. And I'll talk more about how these documents work with a signed document in the background. We'll cover that in a different session. But for now, we're focused just on the simple offer acceptance. Okay. Now, what if the painter is standing in my front step or my sidewalk and says, I'll paint your house for $10. And I say, how about $5? The question the law is going to ask at that point, and that we're needing to ask is that a rejection of their offer, meaning his offer is off the table, or is it an amendment or a counter proposal to their offer that I accept their offer with that one small change? Again, these are things that have this relate to the bigger issue. If you have a sales quote that's very simple, and they make a proposal back, what are the terms? Is the proposal a whole new offer that starts this game over again? Or is the proposal a counter offer that doesn't kind of restart the offer process, it just tweaks one little term? This is an issue of fact. I can't tell you across all your documents what is an offer, what is an acceptance. Honestly, even after you've done these sales quotes and purchase orders, it may be hard to say conclusively which one was the offer, which was the acceptance. We set up our business processes so that we have clarity around that. And that's why we have a lot of the processes we do in purchasing and procurement groups is to control that story and make sure that we're clear on the what is in our contract. So that's the purchase order and the sales quote and the offer that goes back and forth. As we move through the ordering process, we are trying to control, whether you're a seller or a buyer, you are trying to control the narrative of whose contract terms are controlling. Because if I make an offer and you accept it, now my terms control. If I make an offer and you reject it and you make a new offer and then my actions deemed to accept your offer, then your terms control. And so when we talk about battle of the forms, what we're really doing is having this back and forth with each side trying to control those terms. This is why it's so important to manage each communication between a vendor and a seller when we're getting into this level of detail of offers and acceptance. We want to always respond, because what happens is if you don't respond, it creates a question as to whether these terms are part of this story and whose terms are controlling. So that's a big picture of the sales quote, the purchase order, and the offer and acceptance, and why these documents are so important in the process. Let's talk about the process that companies use relating to sales quotes and purchase orders. We're going to go back to this idea of customers interested in buying 20 widgets for $20 to be delivered by Tuesday. If I'm a customer and I'm at that point where I know I need to buy some widgets, I may do two things. I may issue a request for proposal and send it out with a document that describes all my needs. And we'll do an RFP episode another time. So that's an RFP, a request for proposal. I send it out. Everybody can send me a proposal. The other option is just a one-off, and this is what most people do, which is the buyer will reach out to a handful of suppliers they know deal in widgets. They'll say, hey, I need widgets that meet the specification, or I need services that do this. Can you send me a quote? And the customer sends that quote in. So now we've started that process and the buyer has indicated it wants some. Once in a while, you see sellers just send random sales quotes in without any request from a buyer. That's not as common as the buyer initiating the interest in buying something. So what happens is the seller will prepare a sales quote, and the sales quote, and it again says, it'll identify the seller, it'll identify the buyer, it'll identify the products with enough specificity that the parties know what it is they're entering into, what kind of deal they're entering into. Now, when we're talking about sales quotes, one of the things that helps sellers the most is to make the sales quote the contract. So the seller will identify these commercial terms of price, product, delivery time, and other things. And then they'll add a signature to the bottom of the sales quote saying, please sign here to accept. Or maybe it's not so explicit. They'll just say, we need you to sign the sales quote to move forward. But if you sign the sales quote as a representative of a customer, you're agreeing to those terms. If you're just buying a hammer off and it's not important, maybe that's okay. Maybe you don't worry too much about how you're managing it. But the problem you have, and the reason why most companies don't want you as customers to sign sales quotes or agree to sales quotes or otherwise use the sales quote as the contract, is because that obligation is not embodied or tracked in the customer's enterprise resource planning system. Companies always have a system that tracks how much they owe, the financial obligations, the payments they've made, the inventory they have. How does the company work? How across the formation, how are resources being allocated? A sales quote, unless it's entered into that ERP system, isn't tracked. And I've had cases where we discover a binding sales quote somebody signed, and nobody ever knew they signed it until the vendor comes out and says, hey, pay me $1 million. So that's what we're trying to avoid. It's one of the reasons when I work with supply chain groups, I am adamant that nobody ever sign a sales quote because of this risk that they're not being tracked. And most companies as customers have authority levels that are allowed, signature authority and spending authority that are tied to their role. And so if a more junior person signs a sale quote, now we've got somebody approving a purchase that perhaps that's not in their authority in that role to do. So as a customer, you always, always, always want the purchase order to bind you, because that is the process, that's got the controls, that's got the financial tracking. It's a cleaner system for a customer. So when the seller sends in the sales quote to the customer, maybe it's reviewing a bunch of these. It's got 5 different sales quotes, all with different pricing, specs, delivery timetables, warranties. This is where they lay out what they're going to do. A lot of those sales quotes also have terms attached, so that if a customer does sign it or says, yeah, we accept your sales proposal, now there are legal contractual terms attached to that sales quote. Again, something we're trying to avoid as a customer. So when the customer reviews all these quotes from the vendor, they're like, oh, okay, this one I'll take from this vendor. He's the one I'm gonna buy from. And then the customer takes the information and inputs it into that ERP system that is the customer's financial planning system. And they'll go in and there's a tab that says purchase order to purchase. And then he's going to enter all the details into the ERP system. It'll say, what is the product you're buying? What is the price? What is the delivery term? And then that'll get routed. That purchase order, before it's issued, will get routed to the right people in the organization who approve that kind of purchase and that kind of spend. And typically once that is done, and it also may go to the technical person or the internal user who's buying that to approve, yes, my department's budget should be used to purchase this widget. So once it is entered into the system, and this is typically done by somebody in supply chain or procurement, and it's approved by all the proper people, then it gets sent to the seller. And then the seller has to decide whether to accept or reject that. And there is a process where we're watching that communication between the customer and the seller. So let's say I'm a customer, I'm issuing a PO to my vendor or the desired vendor. And I send it out and it says, here's a purchase order for 20 widgets for $20 each, delivered Tuesday. Now, as the seller, you're not bound to accept that. This is an offer. And you, the seller, are now the recipient of the offer, and you get to decide whether you're going to accept it or not. Most purchase orders will say that if I send it and you accept it, you can either reject or accept within 3 days, 10 days, something like that. And you'll have to watch because there's typically a default language. Many companies use silence as binding. Whether that's enforceable or not is a big factual question and depends on the course of dealing of the parties, whether they have a master agreement on someplace else. There's a lot of things that go into it. But if there's not that context that suggests I send you a purchase order and silence is binding, the vendor has to decide whether to accept it or not. And they can reject it. But if they write back and say, I accept, well, now we have a binding purchase order and the terms in the purchase order. Now, one risk area I see a lot of people make a mistake with is how they incorporate the sales quote into the purchase order. So again, a purchase order, it says all my terms as the customer I want. It's got my terms and conditions in small print on the back or in a separate sheet or link. Those are the terms I want to buy. But I'll see people in procurement or lawyers write into the purchase order, governed by sales quote 234 issued July 15th from vendor. And if you go to that sales quote, they have limits of liability, indemnity, maybe credit terms, and where they can cut you off immediately and charge a whole lot of interest, or other late fees if you don't pay on time. It could have a lot of stuff in there incorporated into the sales quote. Vendors, it's in their best interest to get the customer to incorporate the sales quote into your purchase orders. Some of them can be very pushy on that and insist that we can only accept purchase orders that incorporate our sales quote. As a company, you're going to have to decide how to deal with those situations. If I typically, and the lowest risk for a customer is to say no. Do never, ever, ever incorporate a sales quote into your purchase order. That's my hard and fast rule whenever I'm supporting procurement. We never, ever, 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 ever incorporate a sales quote into the purchase order. I'm even careful referencing a sales quote number. And if I do that, I want to do that separately, and in as little commitment as I can. What I want to do is have my purchase order stand alone as an offer without any reference to the sales quote that was already sent. So that's your goal when you're talking about sales quotes and purchase orders as a customer. You want your terms to control, and you want what you sent to be accepted by the vendor. You have to watch the things that the vendor replies with to your offer of the purchase order. You have to be careful. Do they reply and say, by email, you send a purchase order, and the vendor emails back to the buyer in your organization and says, how about $25 each? And that's it. Well, now you've got a counteroffer. And in some contexts, that could be binding on you unless you reject it. So you have to be careful to manage the process between the customer and or between the communications with the vendor when you're sending a purchase order. Be very careful that there's never any communication that suggests any terms other than the purchase order. If you do get an email like that, I always tell my team to stop and have a conversation that you follow up with a documented email that says, as we discussed, we are not, the purchase order is for $20, not $25, and we're rejecting that price. Please accept our purchase order on the terms we discussed. And you're going to want some acknowledgement back unless you've got a framework situation that the purchase order can be accepted. Let's get into now the concepts of what a purchase order and sales quote should say and what it shouldn't say. So these are the things that you're going to look for. It's the same as what you're looking for in a binding contract. If somebody sends you a 3-page contract, you are going to read all the different parts. You are going to make sure that there's clarity on the seller, the buyer, the quantity, the price, the purchase, but also all the legal terms in terms of order process and which delivery terms and when they're going to deliver it and on what circumstances, payment, confidentiality, IP, all those kinds of things are going to be in that 3-page written contract you sign. We have to capture those as well in our sales quote and purchase order. So if you're a vendor and you're trying to do business on your sales quote and you want your customer to sign it and be binding and not have to negotiate a full contract, your sales quote needs to have the right language. So first of all, you have to identify the seller entity. For example, XYZ Inc. Always include a legal name there. I see a lot of companies get sloppy and they just have a kind of the short name, so it's sort of Microsoft as one word instead of Microsoft and each entity name. So you want to identify each entity by their legal name, whether it's a seller or buyer, their address, other information that you're going to want to make sure you're including. If it's a physical good, you need to identify the delivery terms with something we call an Incoterm. An Incoterm is a shorthand. It's a 3-letter acronym that represents an allocation of risk, taxes, customs, and delivery obligations, shipment and logistics. It doesn't cover title, so you still need to have title in your contract, but you should see an Incoterm on your sales quote if it's a physical good, and you want to make sure that that Incoterm is appropriate and the right one for this deal, depending on what you're buying, whether it's cross-border, all those kind of things. So if you've got your sales quote, you're looking for price, the parties, the quantity, and the product. Those are the minimum things. If the seller accepts that, you've got a binding contract. But the question is, what are the other terms? Who owns the IP? Who is obligated to do to keep it confidential? Is there an indemnity? So often sales quotes will have those detailed terms. Sometimes they're incorporated with a link. This offer is subject to the conditions at this link. That is binding if you accept it. So if you see a sales order as a customer with that kind of thing, you want to be careful to reject it. And that's why we never incorporate those sales quotes into our purchase orders. For a purchase order, you're looking for a lot of the same things. Make sure the parties are right, the quantity is right. One of the key things you're deciding is how detailed to get on the description of what you're buying. Do you want to, is it enough to just identify the item by name? The simpler, cheaper, less risky items you purchase, like a tray that's going to be used in the cafeteria, then you don't necessarily have to get into all the detail. But if you're buying a system that has to work a particular way, we typically will have more detail about the specifications of that. The way I like to add detail into a purchase order or a sales quote is with attachments. So I can issue a purchase order and I can have attachments. So in the purchase order, though, I have to reference those attachments. Most purchase orders have a little square where you can put text. I use that to reference my attachments. So I'll say, I'm buying a widget, specification in attachment B, schedule for delivery, attachment C, pricing, attachment D, whatever it is. So I will do those as attachments. You have to make sure you reference them in the copy or in the cover page of the PO so that they get there. You also have to be real careful about what terms and conditions are applying to the PO. I worked with a company that did not attach terms and conditions to their purchase orders. What terms applied? I have no idea. It could have been the sellers, it could have been the Uniform Commercial Code. It was very unclear how that was going to go. So this is one of the critical parts of it that we have to be careful about. When you're doing your purchase orders and you're doing your sales quotes, you're always thinking of it as the contract. What are the contract terms between the parties, and how are you making sure that there's just one story? And we make sure there's one story by looking at the totality of these documents. What does the sales quote say? Did we effectively reject it and not incorporate it into the purchase order? What does the purchase order say? Does it have the key commercial terms? Does it have the legal terms? And we're making sure there's one story. The last thing I want to cover is the concept of master agreements or a signed agreement. Now, purchase orders are individual transactions between the parties. Purchase orders and sales quotes, if that's the binding document, they may be the entire thing. That may be all there is. But sometimes companies, vendors, and customers will sign something called a master agreement or a framework agreement. And that framework agreement has all the legal terms, the indemnity, the IP, the different things, and says the parties may issue purchase orders to each other or orders that are governed by this agreement. If that's the case and you have that master agreement, you want your purchase order terms, whether it's on the cover of your purchase order or in the terms and conditions for your purchase order, to defer to that master agreement. You want to make sure that you don't stay silent. Somewhere in your purchase order, it should say, these terms and conditions govern this purchase order unless there is a signed agreement in place between the parties on this subject matter. So that is typically how most companies deal with the master agreement and the purchase order. You can be more explicit than that, but for most companies I work with, they include something in the terms and conditions that references how it relates to the fact that the parties have a signed agreement, if that's something for that relationship. So there's so much more to talk about, but we've run out of time. I love talking about these subjects. I'm going to be offering a course this fall on contract formation that gets even deeper into purchase orders and sales quotes, master agreements, offer rejection, counteroffer, all the details of how these things work, and also how we do other kinds of contract formation issues with online terms and master agreements and all the complications there. So keep a lookout for that course. I also hope all of you will be joining us at ContractsCon in January. We've got an incredible program planned. You definitely want to be part of that. So thank you again for watching this first episode of the How to Contract show. And I look forward to your comments and excited to share with you next month about the next episode. Bye, everybody.